Okay, well, welcome to this special topic event discussion talking about assessing election implications, hosted by the White Bear Lake Area League of Women Voters. My name is Liz Lauder, and I am the president of the White Bear Lake Area League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a trusted, nonpartisan organization that encourages citizens to participate in their government. Our mission is to support voter education and voter rights. While the League of Women Voters studies and takes positions on issues, we do not support or oppose any political candidate or political party. The White Bear Lake Area League of Women Voters serves 32 communities across the northeastern metro of the Twin Cities area. Our goal with these public meetings is to present topics on government, politics, voting, and public policy issues from knowledgeable experts in support of our mission to educate our community on these issues. The way this meeting will be structured is for our guest speaker to present his information in 10 to 15-minute segments, and then pause for a few minutes to answer questions. Tonight's facilitator is Lisa Larson, and she will be reading the questions. Some of the questions were submitted in advance to our League of Women Voters email. You can also type your questions into the chat during the meeting. We may not get to all of the questions. We want to be mindful of everyone's time. But we encourage you to join in the discussion and to continue talking about these issues with your family, your friends, and your acquaintances in the days ahead. This meeting is being recorded and will be available to watch later on our YouTube channel. A link to the recording will also be available on our website, which is www.lwv-wbla.org. I'll put that in the chat for you. At about 7:25, I will come back and wrap up the meeting and give you some information about upcoming League events. So let me introduce our guest speaker tonight. His name is Dr. Andy Aoki. He is a political science professor at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. Dr. Aoki specializes in racial and ethnic politics and American political thought, and he teaches courses in political theory and American politics. He publishes work on immigration, Asian American and other ethno-racial politics, multicultural education, and popular culture and politics. He is also regularly provides a commentary to print and broadcast media on issues related to elections, including KSCP's Political Insider and WCCO's Good Question programs. And we're glad to have you with us, Dr. Aoki. Thank you for coming.
Thanks. My video has been turned off externally, so someone else is going to have to turn it on, I think.
Okay. We'll work on that just a second. Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, there we go. Here I am. Thanks. We're all learning things with Zoom, I think, every week as we go along, and always something new.
It takes patience.
Yes. Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I appreciate everyone being here. It's so different these days. We used to say, appreciate your coming out, but we're all just kind of sitting at home pretty much. But I appreciate your sitting at home and tuning in.
Especially on a night like this.
Yes, it's the pandemic's not good, but this is one benefit of not having to brave the elements a night like tonight. So I had a few remarks I was going to make. I wasn't sure. Lisa, did you want to say anything before I get started?
No, thank you. It's your show.
Okay. Okay, so I had a few thoughts I would start with, and then there are some questions people sent in, so we can turn to some of those too. But I thought I would start in a sense from a logical, chronological framework, and question a lot of people have had, and I've been asked by neighbors about this already, is about, of course, before the election, most of us are looking at the polls, and by the Wednesday after November 4th, I guess that was, I already had some people ask me what happened with the polls. And I thought that's probably a question a lot of people had, so I'd try and say a little about that. It's a little bit of a technical question, so this is the only time tonight I'm going to share some slides to help explain this. Because when we talk about polling, one thing that's, I think, useful to understand is what we call the source of error, or why there's polling error. And so what I'm going to do is share my screen and try to explain a little bit about how polls can go wrong, and then show some numbers from the polls, or some summary numbers from the polls from 2020. I'm not as sure the polls were as wrong as some people have said. I think it might be something the media has picked up on and perhaps hasn't completely looked at the data, but certainly there were problems. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. Hopefully everyone sees this, assessing the polls. And I just wanted to talk a little bit, explain why they're errors. Well, we all know when you look at a poll, they will talk about the margin of error. Social scientists sometimes refer to that as the sampling error. This is error that comes from the inevitable variation when you're sampling. So even if you conduct a poll perfectly, there's always going to be the potential for sampling error. So no matter how well the poll is conducted, there's going to be some variation. And of course, if you've listened to this, you know it's often 3.5% or so. They'll say the margin of error is 3% or 3.5%. Again, this is an inevitable source of error that will be there even if the poll is conducted perfectly. Now, like just about all human endeavors, surveys are never conducted perfectly. So there are other sources of error. I wanted to explain that just a little bit. One of the most important sources of error for these election polls comes in what we call weighting. When the poll is conducted and they get the results, it's never perfect. And they look at the respondents, and you always see that it looks like you maybe didn't get enough of one or another type of respondent. So maybe a poll has only 45% women. Well, that's too low. It should be higher. And so what pollsters do after they get in their raw results is they weight the results. They adjust them. They just apply fairly simple statistical adjustments to make the numbers come out the way they should in terms of certain categories, such as gender or age. In 2016, it was already common to weight for education. However, that was not done in the state polls. And it's generally believed that that's one reason the state polls perform so much worse than the national polls, because we now know that there is some significant difference in support for Trump and for Democratic candidates by education. In 2020, they were all weighting the state polls for education, but there always are decisions that have to be made, and you can never be sure if you're weighting properly. So this is one potential source of error, although it takes a while, of course, to be sure exactly where that was. Another important source of error for election polls is the likely voter calculations, calculating who are likely voters. Because of course the polls are really interested in how the election is going to turn out, and that's based on voters. And if you supported Joe Biden, but you don't plan to vote, you're not going to have any impact, obviously. So they've got to figure out who are likely voters. And that's tricky. There are different approaches to this. Different pollsters have different adjustments they make, but that always leads to some variation as well. And then there's a third issue that I want to talk about, and that's late deciding voters, which can interact with the likely voter calculation and create real challenges. Of course, some people just don't make up their minds till late. Of course, there were a lot of jokes this time on who on earth could be undecided in November, but were some people. It didn't appear to be a lot of people, but there's another group of people who overlap with this likely voter calculation. That's the people who may not have decided whether or not to vote. And so you have some people who maybe already knew who they were supporting. They said, well, I'm supporting Biden, I'm supporting Trump, but they hadn't decided whether to vote, or maybe they didn't think they were going to vote until late. And pollsters are trying to figure out who's going to vote, who the likely voters are. But if someone, say on November 1st, still didn't think they were going to vote, they may come through as not a likely voter, and they're not going to be counted in the likely voter calculations. Well, of course, if November 2nd, maybe they decide to vote, and that's going to throw off calculations. We have some early evidence that the Trump campaign did a better job than the Biden campaign in turning out voters, and they may have picked up a number of infrequent voters, including some people who may have been voting for the first time. If that was the case, they would likely not show up as likely voters when the pollsters screen for that. So that could explain some of the source of error as well. And then overlapping with this, what all pollsters stress is polls are snapshots. They're not forecasts. They're a picture of things at that time. It takes some time to conduct a poll, 3 or 4 days. And so if there are late breaking changes, the polls may miss that. So all those things can contribute to other sources of error on top of the sampling error. And so the sampling error, again, is often 3.5%. But if you add in these other sources of error, I always suggest to people, you think of it really as more 6% or so. The sampling error is the minimum amount of variation there might be, but there always are other sources of variation. And so it's going to be much more than the 3 or 3.5% they mentioned. Again, I think in my own mind, 6.5% or so. I know when I was looking at the polls on November 2nd, a friend emailed me and said, "What's your forecast?" I usually don't do that, but I looked at the polls and I did my calculations of the error I know of. And I forecast electoral vote of 270 to 320, and it's going to fall right in there. But I did that taking into account the error that I know is in the polls. If you don't do that, you can get a real misimpression. And people are talking about a potential landslide, I think, really weren't taking that into account very well. Well, I wanted just to show you a couple other things, 2 or 3 other things. This is the 2016 and the 2020 national polls. You can see in 2016, the national polls are pretty close. When you get within 1.1%, and the negative means it overestimated the Democratic share, but still within 1% or so, that's pretty good. 2020, they did much worse, but that's still not that bad. There's reason to be concerned about the polling, but it's not that bad to be within 4%. So this was the Real Clear Politics national average versus the actual. And the Real Clear Politics national average is about 4% above what the actual vote appears to be. So as I was saying when I began this, I'm not convinced the polls did as badly as some people suggested, but certainly there were some problems. And to give you one other comparison from 2020, these are state polls. They're not all the states, obviously. I think there's about 17 here. And what this is showing you is how far off they were. The averages, again, from Real Clear Politics. The negatives mean that they forecast a higher Biden share than actually came in, and the positives mean they forecast lower Biden share than came in. And you can see, again, when you look at these numbers, they're not that far off. There are a few that are a ways off. Ohio, 7.2% off. Wisconsin was 6% off. Iowa was 6% off. So there's some that really did not do well, but a lot of them, they're within 1 or 2 points, 3 points. So I am not yet ready to buy the story that the polls did as badly as people said, but there were problems, and it probably came in part from the waiting, in part from people deciding late. And it's always difficult to make sure you had a representative poll, and so there may have been some problems there too. One other thing I thought I'd show quickly, this Nate Silver did at 538. He calculated the average error in polls in the last 21 days, going back to 1972. And you see at the bottom, the average error is 4.1%. And then he's listed the individual years. We don't need to look at that. But I just want to remind you, just going back up a couple slides. So he found the average error over the last 50 years roughly is about 4.1%. And that was the error this year. So again, I'm not certain the polls did as badly as some people suggested, but there are some problems, and it probably comes with some of the difficulties in getting a representative sample and knowing how to adjust it properly. So I wanted to talk about a few other related things some people had asked about already. And one related point, I know some people wondered as well, did the blue wave materialize, or why did it not seem to materialize? One thing that struck me was the election night, and well, the next day really seemed to proceed much the way a lot of people had suggested. In the states like Minnesota, where the precinct personnel are allowed to count the absentee ballots ahead of time, and so they could feed them in as you're going through election day. We saw more representative results. In some cases, when they fed them in early, you saw Biden numbers go up and then Trump numbers go up later as the election day voting numbers came in. But in places like Pennsylvania, where of course they were not allowed to start counting until election day, which is frankly just nuts, I think. Then you saw the so-called red wave, or some refer to as the red mirage, come in. And then as the absentee ballots came in, of course, in Pennsylvania, Biden won a substantial percentage of that. So it looked to me like we saw the kinds of things that actually people forecast, given this unprecedented situation with so many absentee ballots and early voting. And I would just add that given all the challenges, it's really testimony to the strength of our electoral processes. And I think that's a useful thing to stress, because folks like the people here have really worked hard, I think, to help make that the case. And faced with the challenges, it's really remarkable how well the balloting went on election day. And those poor folks working late in the night and around the clock trying to count the absentee ballots, it's just striking, I think, the job they did. They really deserve a lot of commendation. But it really does raise interesting questions for the future. I know a lot of people have wondered about that. As I was just saying, in my mind, this has gone remarkably well, given how little time they had to prepare. I mean, none of us, of course, anticipated this pandemic a year ago, and it takes a while to prepare for these things. So given how well they went, I would guess there's going to be a lot of interest in doing this more, and certainly in a state like Minnesota, where it can be kind of chilly on election day, there is some benefit to being able to vote ahead of time. Another question that some people asked about is how partisanship affected things. And one thing that a lot of analysts have discussed in the last 10 years or so is that the country, of course, is very deeply divided. And what that does is it really locks in votes. So in some ways, the closeness of this election was less surprising, because fewer and fewer people are willing to cross party lines. And that obviously creates some challenges for governing, because even when elected officials are inclined to compromise, they have to be concerned about constituents who are going to be angry about that. And so I think you have sometimes elected officials of goodwill who are struggling with deciding whether they should compromise, and sometimes having to do, if they do so, they have to face angry constituents, and that reflects the partisan divide in this country, which is frankly, I think, unfortunate. But one other thing I wanted to touch on before getting some questions, a lot of people have asked me about the Electoral College. My sister-in-law asked me about the Electoral College, in fact, a week or so ago. And a lot of people are concerned about that. And I think regardless of party or ideology, it has to be a concern if you start getting a number of elections where the person who wins the popular vote loses the electoral vote. That's just not good for democracy, regardless of your partisan views. the trouble is it's in the Constitution. It's very difficult to change. And what we do know just statistically is that when we have a closely divided country like we do now, that greatly increases the chance we will get the split decision. One person wins the popular vote, another person wins the electoral vote. That didn't happen for a long time, of course. Happened in 2000, happened again in 2016. The last time we saw that happening multiple times in a relatively short period was also when the country was deeply divided in the late 19th century. So it doesn't look good for avoiding these kind of split decisions, but it is very hard to change. And the one thing I would add is there's really no formula you can put in to make it better, short of the thing some have suggested that states require their electors to vote for whoever won the popular vote. But that's essentially abolishing electoral college. So unfortunately, there's not really any simple fix, at least no simple fix that's likely to happen. You would really need to abolish it unless, again, states required their electors to vote for the national winner. And that's hard to see happening. So these are questions that various people have asked me in the last week or so. And I thought I'd just get to that because I'm sure they're on the minds of a lot of you. But I wanted to get to some other questions that I think people had sent in. So I'll let Lisa read some of those.
Well, Dr. Aoki, one of the questions pertains to both the error in polls, but also the media generally. There's been a discussion about the error in the polls and what significance that had in terms of affecting voter turnout, voter choices. But you have the polling data compounded by media reports. There are very many sources of media, and there are also many different pollsters, more than there have ever been, I think is a fair statement. So to the extent we worry about the error and we worry about the dissemination of the error, what impact does all this information have on the outcome of an election, and specifically this election?
I think the good news is that it doesn't necessarily have a big impact. It can have some, but what the campaigns do make a big difference, and what average people do make a difference. And so to take the Trump campaign, obviously there's no question that you heard a lot of media reports about a potential landslide, which of course would not be good for Trump. But they were working very hard. And again, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, the preliminary evidence we have suggests that they did a good job at turning out their supporters. So when the campaigns are really working well, I think they're able to overcome, the message that might be coming through the media that, this election is decided or one person is way ahead. Now, if the campaigns don't do a good job, certainly it's possible that some voters may decide, well, it doesn't matter, one person's already won. And of course, there's some evidence that happened a little bit in 2016, that some potential Clinton voters didn't vote thinking the election was decided. But again, when campaigns really are doing a good job at trying to mobilize voters, I think the evidence is they can overcome that, but it does take work. And that's where average people, I think, play an important role too. When people talk to their friends, their neighbors, their family members, that's a big influence, and they're able to turn them out. So, short answer is that the media can have some impact, but I don't think it necessarily would. And there are things that can be done to overcome that, even though there's legitimate reason to be concerned.
Well, here's another question that is related to your comments about the Electoral College and partisanship that forecloses compromise among elected officials who might be inclined to undertake it. How disenchanted is the public, do you think, with the current political system? And what, if anything, can be done? And we as an organization such as the League of Women Voters would like to know, because we believe in full and fair debate and good outcomes, however that's defined.
Well, I'll start with the bright side, or what I think is the bright side, which is, what groups like yours do, I think, is so valuable, and it needs to be done. And I really congratulate you for doing it, because people at the individual level, the neighbor to neighbor, worker, coworker to coworker level, can make some difference. We're faced with what appears to be a really tough situation right now. The research that I've seen suggests that people are increasingly living their lives in spheres where they don't interact with people with different views. And that is causing some real problems. There is a lot of disenchantment with the partisanship, but unfortunately, a lot of the public is feeding that. And we know that there's been this huge growth in hostility towards opposing partisans. We have evidence that people don't necessarily feel that much more warmly towards their own party, but they feel a lot more hostility towards people of the other party. It's a real problem, and nonpartisan groups like the League of Women Voters, I think, are so important, trying to overcome that and bring people together from different different points of view, and talk to each other, because we do have this problem. There's a lot of evidence. For instance, one piece suggests that people today are less likely to have a friend of the opposing party than they used to be. Less likely to interact, and we need people to talk to each other, because when they do, they realize they're not these monsters with horns in their heads. But if people don't have a chance of talking to people of different views, boy, I see a grim future for this country.
Well, and here's the last question I've got for this segment, and it pertains to partisanship too, in a very surprising area, at least from the standpoint of the League. And that is, how do you think all of this partisanship that was expressed in practical terms with the post office, for example, in political terms with allegations of fraud, and in legal challenges to mail-in ballots, how will all of that affect mail-in voting, which certainly in the pandemic was a key piece of participation?
Yeah, there's a lot of elements there. We had attacks on the integrity of the democratic system at a level we've never seen before, and that's a big question for the future. With the mail-in voting, the thing about it is that candidates of both parties can benefit. And I think there is some awareness in both parties of that, obviously not among everyone of both parties, but there is some awareness of that. And so my suspicion is that on balance, there's going to be more support, given, frankly, how well it worked. We appear to have once again had a remarkably successful election in terms of election administration, as I was saying earlier, under incredibly difficult circumstances. Not like a state like Oregon, which has been running mail-in voting for years. There are states that were having to figure this out on the fly, who succeeded. So I think when the dust has settled, and as folks of both parties realize it helps our voters as well as theirs, my guess is that there's going to be more support. Although I agree that there is a group out there that is deeply suspicious. But the reality is that people of both parties benefit from that. People with mobility impairments, people who have to work long days, they're not all Democrats, they're not all Republicans. And so I think what we saw with that is really a success story. We saw a lot of people working hard, making mail-in balloting work. And I think that's going to be the takeaway lesson once the dust settles.
Well, if we might change the topic, if that's all right with you, and
Sure.
talk a little bit about the result of this election in the sense of what might be accomplished. How much of a mandate does winning the popular vote provide for President-elect Biden? Appreciating that the President Trump got the second largest number of votes ever.
You know, there's different ways of thinking about a mandate. In specific terms, the reality for any candidate is it's very limited because people vote for a candidate for different reasons. In order to win, you've got to bring together a lot of different folks with different views. You have to form a winning coalition. And those people have different opinions on things, on healthcare, for instance. There obviously are some people who voted for Biden who really want Medicare for all. There are other people who voted for Biden who do not want that. And so that complicates any specific policy mandate. But in addition, the realities of American politics right now are going to make it hard to get things done, to push things through Congress, because of course, the Republicans could very well retain control of the Senate. I frankly think that's better than a 50-50 chance because Republicans tend to do well in special elections. And without control of the Senate, it's going to be extremely difficult. So regardless of what kind of mandate that Biden might have, he would struggle. And of course, even if Democrats somehow won both those special elections, if the filibuster survives, I'm not sure it would, but if it did, it would still be very hard to get things through the Senate. So it's a limited mandate, I think, for any president, but given the current situation, it's just going to be very difficult to affect any major change. And of course, people have already talked about Biden doing a little bit of what Trump did, using a lot of executive actions if he's going to try and do things. And of course, he'll start with reversing a lot of things that Trump did.
This is probably a little bit off topic, but the notion of executive actions has significant consequences in terms of governing. The Trump administration was certainly not the first administration to govern by executive fiat, some might say. It is slightly off topic, but it is very pressing. Do you have a comment about executive action in the context of getting things done, particularly if the Senate remains in Republican hands?
There's a lot that could be said about that. First, what the Trump administration helped show is that Congress has ceded a lot of power to the president. There still are significant checks that could be exerted, but Congress has surrendered a lot of them. And of course, when there's a Republican president, the Democrats oppose that. But when there's a Democratic president, Democrats tend to support it, Republicans oppose it. I think Americans in general should probably be concerned about that because there has been a lot of power ceded to one person, and there's reason to be concerned about any one person having that kind of power. But the reality is that it's getting increasingly hard to get things through Congress. In part, the use of executive actions reflects the struggles, some, if they were unkind, would say the failures of Congress to be able to come to agreement. And so folks look to the president, and that's the only place sometimes that much can happen. But it is a concern, and the only solution would be for Congress to be able to work the way it used to, but unfortunately, I don't see that happening in the near future.
May we switch topics again now and talk a little bit about demographic relations?
She froze up.
Older, white, and rural. How will Republicans expand what is a demographically shrinking base?
Yeah, Republicans faced a big challenge, and they knew that in 2012. Of course, they commissioned the so-called postmortem, talking about that, saying we've got to expand the base. And the core constituency is older, and it's becoming a smaller and smaller part of the electorate. Now, what I think many would say after 2020 is that they are on the beginnings of a successful effort to do that. The early evidence we have is they had surprising success among Hispanic voters in Florida, in Texas. Whether or not that will continue, of course, is an open question. But I think all the thoughtful Republicans have acknowledged we've got to expand. We can't continue to win on a shrinking share of the electorate, but they would also say, there are significant efforts to do that, and our success with Hispanic voters are the beginnings of that. Obviously, there have been actions taken trying to make voting more difficult, but that's not a long game you can play. That may be a medium-term game, but at some point you've got to expand your constituency. But they do seem to be trying to do that. And of course, the flip side is some people said the Democrats and the Biden campaign in particular did not do an adequate job appealing to some of these populations. And I think as they realize that, I think there is going to be a real push in the Biden administration to do something immigration. Nothing is likely to get through Congress, but that gets us back to some of the previous questions where it seems likely he's going to act through executive actions to try and do something on immigration. The other place where Republicans are facing a challenge, of course, in the suburbs. The suburbs had tended to be a somewhat better place for them, and the numbers suggesting that they're facing more struggles here, particularly with suburban women, but not exclusively with suburban women. And so that's another place where they certainly need to reshape their message. But I think there are a lot of Republicans who think the problem there may have been more the messenger than just the message. There are a lot of people who are turned off, Republicans as well as Democrats, are turned off by kind of belittling talk and name calling and hostility. And I think there are a lot of Republicans who say, well, if we get a different messenger, we can do better there. We just had a difficult messenger this time around.
You talked about the Republicans and their efforts at expanding the base by appealing to certain minority groups. To what extent do you think that the Republican Party will remain the party of Trump? And to the extent, however much it might be, what happens to the question of immigration?
The Trump question is kind of the huge one right now. Trump, it appears, wants to try and stay influential, but you can be certain there are a lot of Republicans, otherwise known as 2024 presidential candidates, who are going to be doing everything they can to wrest away some of his support. And so they're going to be trying to thread that needle, figuring out how to do this without alienating the supporters. To the extent that they remain the party of Trump, it frankly, I think is a challenge for them because, again, the messenger was not that good for them. He really alienated a lot of people who might otherwise be strong Republican supporters, people who just couldn't take the kind of approach and the personal hostility. But the larger strategic approach he took, I think Republicans are going to try and embrace that. It appears to have been continue to have been fairly successful with blue collar voters, for instance. They have peeled away considerable numbers of them, although in Minnesota, the data I saw suggested their success was more limited, but in other states, they've been relatively successful. And of course, that's important in some of these big battleground states in the upper Midwest, Michigan or Ohio, Wisconsin. So I think that Republicans are certainly going to try and continue the same types of appeals, but I think there are a lot of Republicans who are going to try to modify the way the message is delivered. Whether they can do that, obviously, is the big question.
How would you balance out whatever alienation you think arose as a result of this campaign or campaign rhetoric and what is traditionally or often anti-incumbent sentiment in the off-year elections? How much anti-incumbent sentiment, taking into account alienation and so forth, might or might not help the Republicans come 2022. And maybe later we can touch on redistricting, which might have an impact on this too.
Um, it depends. The party in power tends to lose in midterm elections, but I don't think that's so much just an anti-incumbent sentiment as, success is a problem. When you've succeeded, people are less motivated. When you're out of power, it's really great for fundraising. You can really send out those letters and rile up the faithful. So we'll have to see, but yes, the party in the White House tends to struggle a little bit more. Of course, it depends on events over the next 2 years too, and things like the economy. But it's going to be a huge battle. Obviously, the Republicans trying to wrest control of the House back. There are a lot of Republicans up for Republican seats up in 2022 in the Senate. And so there's going to be a battle there. But I don't think there's necessarily going to be not necessarily a strong anti-incumbent sentiment. It often does depend a lot on events that happen. And if things go well, that anti-incumbent sentiment is probably going to be fairly modest in 2022. If things don't go well, it's going to be strong.
Well, may we switch to another topic, news and media? How do you think President Trump's adversarial relationship with the news media affected political news reporting, if it did?
Of course, it's complex because he had a fairly good relationship with some media, Fox, obviously, and a few other conservative outlets. But it probably deepened the political divide. As far as the reporting, I think the real dilemma that a lot of the mainstream media had was we have never had a president who has said so many things that just aren't true. We just haven't. Republican or Democrat, I've never seen it like this. It's just astonishing. And in the past, we've had every president, Republican as well as Democrat, said some things which may have been stretching the evidence. But the medias tend to say, okay, we're going to give that a ride for the most part. We might do some fact checking, but we're going to report what the president said. But in this case, where there was just so many things said that just were not correct, beginning, of course, with the inauguration crowds, it was a real dilemma. And then you risk running into this increasingly bitter feud, really, of then Trump saying they're biased against him. So I think it created a real dilemma for them, and it did make it harder for them to find that line that a lot of outlets, including the main Fox News desk, I think, really try and strike, of presenting some relatively balanced reporting. So I think it created a bigger dilemma for the media because they had to be making this call so many times. Well, what he said just doesn't seem to be correct. What do we say about it?
Speaking of untruths, misrepresentation, and outright lies, what impact do you think these continuing allegations of fraud in the election process are having on people's attitudes toward elections, the news, our governmental institutions?
It's the most dismaying thing for me that I've seen in a long time politically. And maybe I should give context. One of the things that had really been a source of pride for me, regardless of who won the election, the presidential elections, is the way that the loser, whether Democratic or Republican, would concede and really do so in a way that embraced our democratic process. Some of the most moving things I've seen have really come from the losing candidates. John McCain's incredibly gracious concession speech in 2008 still brings tears to my eyes because he really did it in a way that acknowledged the historic nature. It had to be a hard time, but he also did it in a way that made it clear that he supported our democratic process so fully. And we've seen Democrats do that as well. I remember Walter Mondale's 84 concession, and it had to be a somewhat difficult time because he got absolutely crushed. But he came out and he also made it clear he embraced the democratic process. We've seen that from every losing candidate. We've never seen this kind of assault on the process from the top. And that's really worrisome because the evidence we have from other parts of the world is that you can lose a democratic process a lot faster than you can build it up. We have had this really proud bipartisan tradition, Republicans as well as Democrats, at least at the top, making it clear that that was their top allegiance. I mean, Al Gore's 2000 concession was remarkable to me, and this is such a heated time when his supporters were incensed about the Supreme Court. He said, no, we're going to accept this. We're going to accept the process. And he was saying implicitly the process is more important than any individual, than any party. And so this departure from that for the first time in our country's history is really disturbing to me. It worries me very much because it's a lot easier to undermine it than it is to build it up.
We have less than 10 minutes left, so I'd like to switch and ask a question or two that is Minnesota specific. In your opinion, what effect will election outcomes have on redistricting legislative and congressional district boundaries in Minnesota and perhaps other states too in 2021?
I haven't had time to check all the states. I was kind of focused on the presidential election. For Minnesota, it looks like it's going to the courts. I mean, there's divided control, of course, and it's going to be hard for them to get agreement. Now, if Minnesota somehow hangs on to all their congressional seats, maybe they could come with some sort of agreement. But I think it's likely we're going to lose a congressional seat. I mean, I believe we were the last state to hang on to all of ours back in 2010. Unless there's some surprising things in the census, and who knows, since the census had so many problems, but unless there are some surprises, there's a good chance Minnesota will lose one. And when you lose a seat, boy, it gets pretty bitter then. And so with divided control of the legislature, it seems very likely it's going to go to the courts. They typically don't impose radically different maps. So my guess is we're going to see things that are somewhat similar to what we've had, although again, when you've got to carve out one seat, reduce your congressional delegation by one seat, that's going to be tough. And I'm not quite sure, how that's going to go.
Here's a question about legislation. And there was a push in the last biennium to legalize marijuana. And the question is, will Minnesota Democrats again push legalizing marijuana, given the number of votes the Minnesota Marijuana Party siphoned off from Democratic candidates?
I think in normal times they might, because it's not such a partisan issue, but of course these aren't normal times. And there's going to be so much that's going to need to be done with the budget, the deficit, and obviously the pandemic, sadly, doesn't look like it's going anywhere soon. So my guess is that's probably going to take a back seat. When I looked over the numbers quickly, it did look like there were too many races that could have been tipped by that. There may be two, maybe three. So a lot of the races I saw where a candidate ran there, it was a really lopsided margin. But again, I think because of these other really pressing issues, and we're going to have divided control of the legislature, so it's going to be hard to get agreement. My suspicion is that legalizing marijuana isn't going to get very far this time around.
Since we have about 4 minutes, I thought I would try to squeeze in one question more, if you wouldn't mind. And it has to do with the gazillions of dollars, actually more than 14 billion that have been spent on this election cycle. What do you think are the prospects for campaign finance reform?
It's not good. The last time we saw a major campaign finance reform was, of course, when John McCain teamed up with Russ Feingold and other Republicans and Democrats came together for bipartisan reform. But that sadly seems like a thing of the past, at least for the time being. You've got to get both parties working together. The Supreme Court also has made it very difficult. Of course, what happened to what became known as the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act was that it was gutted by the Supreme Court. So it would be really tough to do a lot right now. But the campaigns are expensive. On the bright side, we obviously saw this extraordinarily high turnout, driven in part by the partisanship. But the money helps with some of that turnout. So, I don't think we're going to see anything done significantly about campaign finance reform, but the spending does help get more people out, and that at least seems to be a good thing.
Speaking of campaign finance reform, in your estimation, how is the money, where is the biggest bang for the buck when we talk about financing campaigns? What's most persuasive?
For the campaign, you mean, or for reform?
For the campaign, what is it that they want to buy so desperately?
Well, of course, if you're talking about big campaigns like the presidential campaigns, the advertising is incredibly expensive. $50,000-$60,000 ad buys are small ones, and you get into some of these states and the media markets are really expensive. Atlanta, I think, is a relatively expensive media market. Pennsylvania has some expensive media markets, so you can easily be dumping in $500,000, $1 million, $2 million. There's just so much. The polls. People didn't like the polls, but I guarantee you the campaigns will still be using them every time. That's expensive. A poll can run you $5,000, $10,000 for one poll, and they're running them constantly. In terms of biggest bang for the buck, there's a debate, but I think the plurality of people would say you really need to put into turning people out, and that is the one criticism some Democrats made of Biden. Obviously, the pandemic made it much more complicated, but you've got to turn the people out, and that takes boots on the ground. And volunteers are important, but you have to have someone paid to coordinate it, because it takes a lot of work to coordinate thousands and thousands of volunteers. So that's probably the biggest thing, but advertised, I think, is a close second.
Well, Dr. Aoki, you have been so generous with your time, your knowledge. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to hear about elections from someone who is knowledgeable, can safely say he knows what he's talking about. And I believe our president, Liz Louder, would like to conclude with a few remarks.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Dr. Aoki. Your talk has really helped us think about these election events in practical terms, giving us new perspectives for interpreting what may happen as a result of the outcome. I want to thank all of you who joined us tonight and for your participation in this discussion. The League of Women Voters is committed to providing information like this to help people make sense of public policy issues. I want to thank our League members who helped out with our event tonight. Thank you especially to our facilitator, Lisa Larson, and our members will continue to discuss these ideas and the possibilities that we heard tonight in our unit meetings in December. So for more information about the League of Women Voters White Bear Lake area, you can visit our website at www.lwv-wbla.org, which I just put in the chat for you guys. And you will find a link there to our presentation tonight. And if you wanted to share that with anyone else, that's going to be posted on our YouTube channel very soon. Our next public meeting will be on February 4th, when we will host Tawana Black, who is the founder and CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion. She'll be telling us about her work to dismantle structural racism and economic disparities in Minneapolis and St. Paul. You can sign up to participate on Eventbrite. Look for LWV White Bear Lake area, and the title of the event is Advancing Inclusive Economic Growth. So thanks again for coming, and be well and stay safe. And thank you again, Dr. Aoki. It's been a real pleasure having you with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.